Hi, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist in No Labels, here for another edition of No Labels Talks. And with me, as always, to talk about what we're going to talk about on No Labels Talks is Holly Page. What's going on, Holly?
Hey, Ryan. Another week has gone by.
Yes, chaos at home, chaos abroad. We had police storming Columbia University last night to drag the anti-Semites off campus. It's weird out there.
I'm not that old, but it does remind me of some of the issues and the unrest that was going on in the 1970s. We've got issues with Iran and Russia. We've got unrest on college campuses, completely different set of issues. Obviously, I'm not equating the two, but nonetheless, and I think we have a crisis in leadership as our guest gets into in the podcast in a few minutes. But
yeah, I mean, well, that's what, Walter Russell Mead is our guest this week. He's just really thoughtful foreign policy thinker. He writes a regular column for the Wall Street Journal at the Hudson Institute. And that was actually his column this week in the Journal was about how President Biden finds himself in this really impossible position between, on the one hand, the needs of American national security, but also the political situation here at home, and how those two things often don't connect, in that the things that he might have to do to strengthen the country's security are things that elements of his political base aren't going to like. And it isn't clear yet that he has managed to work his way through that tension.
well, I know we've been speaking with our national network over the last several weeks and just talking about what we learned through the 2024 presidential process. And one thing that keeps coming back up is, an understanding from our network anyway of why good people would choose not to run for office. And particularly, the stress and the focus on families, the willingness to kind of, nothing's out of bounds, nothing's inappropriate. And I think it is chasing really good people who might be inclined to serve away.
Yeah, if you're a normal person and you've had some success in the military, in business, whatever, sports, you name it, and you look at the freak show that American politics has become, a lot of people ask themselves, why do I want to subject myself to that? And look, Holly, because you're in a lot of these same conversations that I was, when No Labels was talking to candidate prospects for our 2024 Unity ticket, this was a real barrier. People asking themselves, do I want to subject my family to this? Because it's so ruthless. There's things that used to be out of bounds that now aren't. I mean, for example, look, you know this well. It was always agreed you never went after a politician's family, right? So you never talked about Chelsea Clinton or Donald Trump's son Barron or anything else, and now you can start to see that kind of breaking down. You can understand why people don't want to step into the ring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it is part of our plan for the future to help build a community and a network of people who can support and encourage and reward, problem-solving politics and the men and women who are willing to make the sacrifice to advance them through government. So,
what's fascinating is, the title of the podcast this week is Be the President. And the reason it's called that is because we actually asked Walter Russell Mead if he had advice, if he were to President Biden, if he were his political advisor, what would you tell him? And that's what he said, be the president. And I think his point was, leaders are there for a reason, because you just have to lead. And I think there's so many circumstances. Look, right now, the college presidents are probably the most striking example of this. Where I think a lot of people wonder, why are a lot of you in this job? Because you just don't seem to have any center, any convictions, and you're just getting pushed around by agitators who are turning your campuses into places where it's impossible for kids to learn. And I do think that people are hungry for that.
No doubt about it.
Who's just willing
Yeah.
to get up and say, this is what's right, this is what needs to happen. And I'm going to be unapologetic about saying it. Well, look, let's let Walter speak for himself here. We actually brought in this week's No Labels Talks a special guest, Paul Haga, who is a longtime No Labels supporter, former board member at NPR, really successful business person. So Paul and I had a really fascinating conversation with Walter, and I encourage you all to listen to it here at the next edition of No Labels Talks.
Great. And maybe next year next week we can move into the 1980s. We seem to be stuck in session.
Working our way forward.
Exactly. Thanks, Ryan.
Hi, this is Ryan Clancy here for another edition of No Labels Talks. And I'm bringing a friend with me this week, my co-host, Paul Haga. Paul is the retired chairman of the board of Capital Research Management, former board member of NPR, and a longtime supporter of No Labels. And we're going to be talking today with one of the most thoughtful foreign policy voices in America today to talk to us about what's going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. Paul is going to introduce you to him, and then we're going to be off talking. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Walter, for being with us today. Walter Mead is the Ravenel Curry Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at Hudson Institute and the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College. And importantly, for our view today, the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. He has written on a wide variety of subjects, ranging from international affairs, religion, politics, culture, education, and the media. His most recent book, The Ark of a Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, is a bold history of U.S.-Israel relationships that examines the origins of American support for Israel and the relationship's impact on past, present, and future policy. And I hope we'll get some views from this long history, as well as some thoughts about today. He's a graduate of Yale and a founding board member of New America, which has been described as a radical centrist organization, which rings a loud bell with members of No Labels. So thank you for that. And to start with, you just put out an article in the last day or two about how the Middle East is a trap for Joe Biden. Do you want to mention that and also elaborate on it a little bit?
Sure. Am I coming through okay on the audio here? Great. Actually, that's kind of a stupid question because if you aren't, no one will respond. But okay. Look, I think the problem for the Biden administration here is that on the one hand, it's got American policy has to focus on trying to stop Iran's sort of march toward regional domination, whatever you think of the rights and the wrongs of various things, that's really the destabilizing force. And it has driven Israel and a number of the Arab countries together so that even now in the middle of this war and the sort of terrible suffering which the citizens of countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE are seeing, on Al Jazeera and so on, the governments have, if anything, doubled down on their support for Israel. That in the middle of the Gaza war, we saw Saudi and Jordanian planes shooting down Iranian drones that were attacking Israel. It was really extraordinary. I mean, Saudi Arabia fighting for Israel, even as Israel is in the middle of a war with Palestinians in Gaza. And so this constellation of Israel and the Arabs, in some ways, it would be the dream of every American president since Harry Truman, to have the Gulf Arabs and the Jews on the same side in the Middle East. But if you think about from the standpoint of the protesters and the people in the US who are deeply concerned about what's going on in Gaza, and a lot of them are Democrats, and a lot of them are people that the Biden administration is hoping will vote for President Biden in the next election, this is a real wedge issue. Are you really, going to keep supporting Israel even as these terrible things are happening in Gaza? And I think in policy terms, he really doesn't have a lot of choice. He has to say yes, that we are. He is trying to sort of reduce the political costs of that by talking a lot about how sad it is and we need to help the Palestinians and so on and so forth. But substantively, the U.S. has been really giving Israel pretty much what Israel wants. Again, primarily because I think Biden thinks that Israel actually needs to win the war, or at least not lose it to Hamas. But doing that, while it may make sense politically, and the other thing is, this is the path to, if there is a path to a Palestinian state, or at least a path to the Palestinian state, which I think is the most one can pragmatically talk about right now. It seems to be that what would happen would be that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, to some degree the Egyptians, would sort of agree on a new set of Palestinian leaders and put them, both the Fatah leadership in Ramallah and of course the Hamas leadership in Gaza are really, just not able to take on the kinds of responsibilities that you would need if you were going to start a Palestinian state. So there's a kind of a friendly takeover, or maybe from the standpoint of some Palestinians, a not so friendly takeover of the Palestinian Authority by Arabs. And because these Arabs so badly want peace with Israel as a foundation for mutual defense against Iran, they will press that Palestinian leadership to make proposals or accept proposals that the Israelis can get behind. That's the path toward a Palestinian peace. But for a lot of the protesters and a lot of the Muslim Americans and Palestinian Americans, who are actually we have a growing number of Palestinian Americans here, this is actually not a positive thing. For Palestinians, it's the loss of Palestinian control. In a sense, you could argue it's substituting Israeli occupation. You get rid of that, but at the price of accepting an Arab occupation, a concealed Gulf Arab occupation of the Palestinians. And it is also something that strengthens the Arab somewhat authoritarian regimes, the dictatorship in Egypt, the Saudi monarchy, the Emiratis, and so on. And so you have a lot of people in America who are pro-Palestinian, but also very much pro-Arab democracy. So that Biden's path to try to make progress toward a Palestinian state in the middle of this chaos and deal with U.S. national interests is not going to solve his problem with the left wing of the party, which has a pro-Palestinian, somewhat anti-Israel, but also anti-Arab authoritarian element to it. Okay. And it's and the war brings all of this obviously to a head. And meanwhile, he has another problem, which is that if the war drives up the price of oil and therefore the price of gas in the U.S., we not only get people in America very upset about rising gas prices on the eve of the election, we also maybe have more inflationary pressure, which would then make the Fed less likely to cut interest rates, which is sort of tough for the administration on a whole list of reasons. So it's not a good place to be.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you. From what I hear, Biden saying, which is, we need to support Israel, but in addition, occasionally, at least mentioning that they don't want Israel to engage in excesses, let's call it, against the Gazan people. It sounds like he at least understands the general background of what you just said he should be doing. What would you tell him if you had his ear right now and he'd hired you specifically to be his campaign advisor about the Middle East?
Well, I think I would say that what he needs to be thinking about right now is that more than any single issue causing him political trouble, the perception that the world is kind of spinning out of control and that the United States seems to have lost our ability. We couldn't deter Russia from invading Ukraine. We couldn't deter Iran from providing Hamas with the weapons and support that made October 7th possible. That this kind of declining American power to influence world events, even as world events are moving in a scarier direction, this is the real political threat to him that is presented by the outside world. And we have to think, hopefully this will not be an issue before the election, but many Americans haven't yet really thought about what might happen if China attacked or blockaded Taiwan. And what we have to understand is if you look at a map, you'll see that if there's a state of war around Taiwan, which you would have with either a blockade or an attack, you're basically not going to have civilian shipping going in and out, not just of Taiwan, but of China. And in fact, the US would probably, one thing that we would likely want to do in such a case is put up a blockade on China, as a sort of a non-violent, but nevertheless very stringent response to the attack. Not only are we going to lose the silicon chips, the semiconductors that come out of Taiwan and that are vital for the global economy, but anything made in China, and people who ship to China. So if you're a Chilean copper miner or a Brazilian soybean farmer, you're going to lose your customers. We're going to see very limited traffic in and out of Japan and South Korea for the same reason. And the impact of this on the global economy, I think the Bloomberg people estimated it as a 10% cut in global GDP, which is a sort of Great Depression style economic crash. And imagine what this does to stock markets, to interest rates, to a whole slew of things. And anything like this in the world economy, in world society, would be profoundly, obviously, destabilizing and distressing. As we are drifting gradually toward that. And this is the Chinese are, continue. You may have seen today, there's some studies that are coming out that if you really look at the Chinese defense budget, it's roughly equivalent to ours. And we're spending ours globally, and the Chinese is much more regionally focused. So arguably, they're in a stronger position in parts of the Indo-Pacific than we are. You start looking at all of that, and you see just how explosive the international situation is becoming. So my advice to the president would be, frankly, be the president. Explain, think about Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. Start explaining to the American people just where we are, just how dangerous the world is becoming. Explain your plan for dealing with it. Have a credible plan for dealing with it. And I think, if you succeed in looking, sounding, and acting like a president of the United States, you're likely to get some support for that, because I think people are increasingly worried by what they see out there in the world and would like to have somebody in the White House who they think they could trust in that situation.
Walter, you just kind of described a view of the world through the lens of, geopolitical strategy. Of course, that isn't exactly the way some of the people in President Biden's base look at this, particularly the Gaza conflict. You described the Gaza conflict previously as Gen Z's first war. And you've talked about how they view what's unfolding there through the lens of a lot of what they're taught on campuses, which is through the lens of there are two forces in the world, oppressor and oppressed, and the way in which they should engage with the world should be sort of tearing down oppressive power structures. It is a very different way from looking at and engaging with the world than what you just described. So how does President Biden square those two very different things?
Well, it's a difficulty, although I would say that one of the things is that Gen Z will be an important voting bloc. It isn't quite yet. And I would also say that a lot of this is more prevalent on elite campuses, which is a subset of the generation as a whole. I think that, when you look at a lot of polling, what you see is that Gen Z, in terms of the issues that it's concerned about, is not sort of as radical as some of the press stuff would have you think it is. And that even on some of the issues that they do care about, when they start ranking what issues are most important politically, some of these more distinctive things rank further down. But in any, if the president is going to do this and kind of be Paul Revere, what you also need to do is you need to think about, okay, who are other credible people who can bear this message to people who need to hear it, but might not take it from your lips? Opinion shapers who they pay attention to, influencers. The art of leading, art of being president is in large part an art of leading the people. And how do you figure out how to do that? I think we did see, actually, in these 4 bills getting through Congress, the aid bills, some rather heartening and even surprising bipartisanship. Trump actually provided maybe the boost that got these bills over the finishing line by stepping in to support Speaker Mike Johnson at his moment of maximum weakness, and by very, very carefully not intervening against any of these bills at that critical moment. So we have, a bit of a national consensus here, and maybe you can start reaching out. I think there are, if you went to some of the people who were on TikTok or Instagram or whatever and gave them information, briefed them and so on, you might find people, willing to take this. It's an important message. So I think leadership, it's what the country needs, is some leadership. And we obviously have some domestic issues that we need leadership on. But in fact, we're on the cusp of the most serious international crisis in decades. Mm-hmm. And if the federal government and the president of the United States are about anything at all, it's about responding to moments like this.
Walter, you've given us plenty of to think about, but I couldn't help but noticing that you haven't mentioned Russia yet. Is Russia different or less of a threat? I know you in one of your columns a while back, you criticize us for not paying enough attention to Russia.
Well, I think we're not doing enough about Russia. Look, I think it's interesting. You think of 3 major powers or aspiring major powers in the sort of anti-America, anti-existing world order coalition, China, Russia, Iran. You throw in North Korea and some others. But of those 3, China clearly has the most potential and even perhaps actual power, economic, and certainly has the most potential power to be a long-term competitor to the United States. But it's actually, compared to the others, has done the least to change the international situation in its neighborhood. It's sort of he's built a couple of fake islands in the South China Sea. It's sort of pushed the Philippines off a couple of shoals, right? In comparison, Russia has conquered a third of Ukraine, or a fifth of Ukraine. And Iran has basically become the leading international actor in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And Iranian proxies are fighting a war with Israel in the south, threatening to bomb it from the north, and have closed off the Red Sea to international traffic. So the weakest of the three, and Iran is clearly the weakest of those three, has sort of succeeded in making the most mayhem. And Russia is in that middle case. It's less of a potential threat than China, but it has and more of a threat than Iran, but has done less. Not that it wouldn't like to do more. So we need to have a different strategy for each of these, as well as thinking about how do we face their querulous but united opposition. And my fear is that if you really look closely at the Biden administration's strategy for war in Ukraine, it's not a strategy for victory. It's a strategy of dribbling out aid to Ukraine, not enough to win the war, but enough so they don't lose the war, with the idea that at some point the Ukrainians themselves will get tired of fighting a war they can't win, and then will come to Russia and say, let's talk peace. Mm-hmm. What I worry about is, in such a case, I don't think Putin is going to be very nice. I don't think he says, well, you fought a good fight, you fought hard, let's have a reasonable peace deal. He'll say, oh, you're cracking under the strain, I'm going to keep pushing. It's also a strategy. I understand that the $60 billion that we just voted runs out in December of this year, more or less. So are we going to have every 10, 12 months another $60 billion appropriation for Ukraine without a strategy for winning the war? How long, will the American people go with that? How long will Congress keep voting it? And Putin has to be thinking they won't do this forever. Yeah. And so we're spending $60 billion a year, and we're not changing Putin's calculation, right? Trump's approach is, if Ukraine is going to lose the war, why not lose the war without spending the $200 billion, right? Neither of those is a strategy calculated to, make Putin feel he made the wrong choice, right? I'm afraid that to some degree, the current strategy is to make us feel better about ourselves when we look at ourselves in the mirror. We're noble. We're fighting Russia. We're courageous. We love democracy. We love the UN Charter, even as we're actually inhibited from doing something that would make Russia lose the war or settle for a compromise peace that's favorable in some ways to Ukraine.
Walter, this actually feeds into a question that one of our listeners has. Each week in our newsletter, we invite somebody to ask a question of our next week's guest, and this one came from Dorsey Cartwright, one of our supporters in Texas, and she wanted to know how you thought that this chaos in the Middle East, how do you think it is going to affect these conflicts, these cold conflicts with Russia and China? So how is what's happening in the Middle East now affecting the calculations of Putin and President Xi?
Well, I think Putin is actually very happy with this war in the Middle East because it does two things. It distracts the United States from Ukraine. Now we have to think about two wars where we have two places we need to send our military stuff to instead of one. And our policy, energy, and everything else, we're looking at two places. Also, to the extent that it has an economic impact, it's going to be to raise the price of oil. So it puts money in Putin's pocket and it divides and preoccupies his enemies. Win, win, win. China, it's more of a split decision. On the one hand, it does preoccupy us. We are already dangerously low on some of our military stocks. And now we're shipping to Israel as well as Ukraine. You can be very sure there are people in China looking at what all of this means and wondering if the balance of power around Taiwan is changing. They're also obviously looking to see, how effective, how united we are. And they notice we're spending $60 billion on Ukraine and a lot less than that on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific in these bills. So there's that. But the Chinese also, though, don't like a high price of oil. They like a low price of oil. And they don't want threats of instability in the Middle East, making it harder for them to get the energy that their economy depends on. So in some ways, Russia and China Russia is stabbing China in the back, even as China is helping to fund and support Russia's war. Russia is also buying a lot of weapons from North Korea and opening economic relations with North Korea. China actually would like to have more control over North Korea, and Russia is kind of weakening it. So it's complicated, but on balance, it helps Russia a lot, and it hurts us significantly. China, it probably on balance helps, but not as much as Russia.
Great. Walter, you wrote an excellent column on April 22nd after the bills passed, saying, congratulating us for, you talked about, fear as winning. But two questions from that. One is, while you celebrated the message we sent from adopting the bills, do you think that the negative message that was sent to the rest of the world by the difficulty that we had in finally passing the bills undermined any supportive message? And then the second question is, in that piece you raised the question, what should the U.S. defense budget be? Said we had to address it, but you didn't comment on it yourself, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. So those two questions.
All right. Well, look, I think again, the negative message was not so much that we have partisan fighting. If you go back and you look at things like the passage of the Marshall Plan and other sort of major moments in the history of American foreign policy, we have a lot of fighting then too. I think the number of votes against one of the aid packages was 50. That was the number of votes in the House of Representatives against U.S. entry into World War I. We are not necessarily, we're not a unanimous people. I think what is, again, more threatening and more sort of undermining is this thing of we're voting this $60 billion aid package, which will last roughly 6 to 10 months. What are we going to do then? Somebody, I think, once fairly criticized Republican policy toward Iran in the Trump years as you have an attitude, but you don't have a policy. And I'm afraid, that's not a bad description of our approach to Putin right now. We have an attitude, but not a policy. And so it doesn't have as much credibility as we'd like it to be.
Right.
I keep thinking that we should raise the defense budget, for a couple of reasons. One is that there really is no better signal that, we are as a people determined to get our act together and do our part to try to preserve some sort of stability in the world. But at the same time, in terms of numbers, during the Cold War, I think our long-term average was 4 to 6% of GDP into defense during the Cold War. I don't think we need to go to 6. I don't think 4 would be a bad place. The thing is that in some ways, actually, defense spending today is less of a cost and more beneficial than it was in the Cold War. In the 1950s, if you said, okay, I'm going to increase the defense budget, it basically means you're going to make fewer school buses and more tanks, because that was what that was what the money went to. Today, a lot of that money would be invested in helping create some very, very fancy equipment that does a lot of very fast information processing, vision recognition, all this super, super high-tech stuff, which has a lot of commercial applications. So in a way, there's the fusion between defense spending and industrial policy is bigger than it used to be. So that I think we could actually increase defense spending with a good deal less harm and even some benefit to the civilian economy. I'm not saying this like I think defense spending is a good idea or that I want to see a global arms race, but given where we are, this seems to me to be the most prudent way to proceed.
Well, Walter, you've said and written a lot about the threats out there that probably make some people want to crawl under a desk because it's so scary. But you also wrote a couple weeks ago that the United States still has some strengths that Iran, Russia, and China are perhaps underestimating. That there are kind of hidden strengths that the U.S. has if we would just use them. Will you talk through that a bit? What do you mean by that? What are they? And how do we bring them to bear?
Well, I wrote an essay in Tablet not long ago where I made the point that it actually looks to me as if Gen Z in the United States could end up a lot richer than the boomers or their parents. What's happening is, with the pandemic, we suddenly woke up and realized that about half the country does not need to go to work every day in order to get the nation's business done. And many people, many of us probably on this call are doing that at least some of the time. But my point would be, one of the reasons that Gen Z is having a hard time getting started in life is the relative unaffordability of house prices. And why is that? It's because essentially the length of the commute kind of determines the radius of the circle within which you can look for housing. And over the last few generations, we've now built out most of our cities to where it's getting, there's not a lot of developable land within a commuting distance of downtown DC or downtown Chicago or whatever. And so people are sort of faced with these 60, 80, 90-minute commutes, or it's just completely unaffordable moving further in. Working from home can change that. Working from home can mean if you're only going into work, once a week, twice a week, you can actually manage a much more you can find an affordable home. And if we were to start thinking about, how do we actually encourage working from home? How do we make it? And I would also say, by the way, it has a lot of other benefits. It means that older people who would actually I'll use my mother as an example. She actually did not want to retire when she did, but she had arthritis and just the physical wear and tear of the daily commute. She had to stop. But her mind was fine and she was ready to go. In a working from home environment, we have a lot of older people who could keep working. We have a lot of people who have really difficult issues with dealing with older parents, with kids, whatever. Working from home and the flexibility you get makes that better. People who have physical disabilities of different kinds can actually have much greater access to the workforce. It also means people who live in rural areas and so on can have more economic opportunities. There are a lot of really positive social gains to be had from promoting more working from home. And you can also say, well, you can build, if you were going to build kind of a third ring of suburbs or whatever, you can build different kinds of communities. You can learn from the mistakes that maybe you don't have all bedroom communities and then malls and city centers. Maybe you do these more there are just a lot of things you can do. And it would give Gen Z a big urban landscape, suburban, exurban landscape to imagine and inhabit a different and better future, plus making a ton of money as their house prices go up, as they get on the property ladder, and as they lose less of their valuable lives to sitting in traffic. It's also a very green thing. I've seen studies that show that working from home can reduce your carbon footprint by 30, 40, 50% easily. So, save the planet by working from home. This is the kind of message Americans like. So I think it's possible to build an optimistic, forward-looking American program. I think, by the way, too, you could add, smart roads so that smart cars get here faster. That a highway can have, can send information to a car so that during some of the difficult times like rain and stuff that now make, autonomous vehicles less safe, you manage that. So that maybe even when you commute, you're really only having to drive the kind of first and last mile onto the highway. So millions of ways to actually give the next generation another generation of opportunity, sort of retool, rekindle the American dream. I really think it's there. And it's not, it doesn't require radical new technologies. It doesn't require massive changes in the way we organize our whole society. It doesn't require that we sort of give up a lot of the sort of, the things that we like about America. I really do. I think the American dream actually can still work.
Great.
Well, that's great to hear, Walter. Paul, before we let Walter go, because we want to be respectful of his time, is there final questions you might want to pose?
That was to me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say this, if you've given us a lot of really good thinking, both writing and you're talking today about the complexity of the Middle East. If you had 30 seconds to talk to the Gaza protester, the pro-Hamas or pro-Gaza protesters, what would you say to them, and what would you say to the university presidents if you had 30 seconds with them?
Well, I might say to the protesters, you guys remind me so much of when I was your age. Because, we think a lot of us boomers look at them and we think, oh, it's so cute. We used to do this too. And I think I might just say, keep thinking you're at the beginning of a process. The world is a really complicated thing. It's good that you're engaged. It's good that you feel things strongly. But there's a lot of reading you're going to have to do before you've really got that. And let me start. Here's my book, Ark of a Covenant. It's been endorsed by Zionist intellectuals. It's also been endorsed by some left-wing Arab and Muslim thinkers. So take a look. And when you've done this, then think again about how do you make a positive contribution.
Great. And what about the university presidents? What would you tell them?
Grow a spine. Develop some, I think some of these folks have done nothing and then suddenly they panic and they do too much. Sometimes having a spine doesn't always mean that you lock everybody up, but it means you have a set of principles, clear ideas, and you move when it's time to move and you don't move when it doesn't make sense to move. I'm actually going to be working on an essay in the next couple of months about the biggest crisis in America. It's something we really have to work on, is the crisis of leadership. And if you think about it, you look at these polls, every institution in the country is losing the confidence of the people. Whether it's the media, whether it's business, whether it's universities, whether it's religion, whether it's even the military and the courts are going downhill. And a lot of this has to do, building legitimacy and gaining consent for institutions. It involves both knowing how to lead properly, but also how to communicate properly, how to persuade, how to make the linkage between what you as an expert think people ought to be thinking and doing and where they actually are. So leadership is the missing ingredient. We're not teaching it in schools. You used to hear university presidents would routinely say things like, the most important thing we work on here is character. Now you will never hear that. So how do we get back to some of the, and again, it's not going to be like, let's all revert to the way we did this in 1895, because that's not how things work. But how do we find what was valuable about older traditions of leadership and so on, and reimagine and re-engineer it for a very different contemporary world?
Walter, thank you so much for being with us today, sharing your thinking, giving our community a lot to think about. Really appreciate you joining us. Encourage everybody. Walter regularly writes for the Wall Street Journal opinion page, always has thoughtful things to say. We hope you'll come back to us at some other point in the future. Paul, thank you for joining me as the co-pilot here on No Labels Talks. And I just want everybody to know, next week, we actually already have a speaker lined up who will be a great successor to what we talked about today. Michael Mazar from the Rand Corporation, who's out with a new study on some really scary metrics of American decline, how that compares to other countries historically who've been in this position, and most importantly, how we can dig our way out. So remember to look out for our newsletter. On Friday, you'll have a chance to submit a question to Michael Mazar next week, and we'll read it. In the meantime, everybody have a great week, and we hope you'll join us on the next No Labels Talks.
Walter, thank you very, very much. This was excellent.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.